She hasn't spoken to her mother in 6 years. Not because of a fight. Not because of anything she did wrong in her own eyes. She left a church, and in doing so she lost every single person who raised her. This isn't an isolated story. It's happening right now in thousands of homes across Utah, Idaho, and every corner of the world where Mormon families exist. And almost nobody outside that world understands why leaving a religion can feel exactly like watching your entire family die while they're still alive. Picture a Sunday dinner table. Roast in the center, kids fighting over the last roll, grandma asking about work, dad cracking the same joke he's told for 20 years. Now picture that same table, minus one chair. Not because someone passed away, because someone stopped believing. That empty chair is the reality for a growing number of former Latter-day Saints, and the silence around it is deafening. Nobody warns you growing up inside the church that your faith and your family are wired into the exact same circuit. Pull one wire and the whole system can go dark. What follows is the story of what happens after that light goes out, told through the voices of people who lived it, and the psychology behind why it hurts so much more than most people expect. For many who grow up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, faith isn't a Sunday activity. It's the architecture of an entire life. Baptism at 8 before most kids can even name their own doubts. Primary classes that teach obedience before algebra. Youth groups, seminary before school starts. Temple weddings that bind families not just for this life, but, according to doctrine, for eternity. Missions that pull 19-year-olds out of their bedrooms and drop them into foreign countries with a name tag and a testimony to defend. By the time most members reach adulthood, their identity isn't separate from the church. It is the church. Their best friends were made in young women's or scouts. Their spouse was met at a singles ward. Their career network runs through business connections built in sacrament meeting. Their entire social operating system runs on shared belief. Pull that thread and you're not just questioning a teaching. You're questioning the architecture holding up your whole life. So when doubt creeps in, and for a growing number of members it does, the stakes are almost incomprehensibly high. This isn't like quitting a gym or switching political parties. Leaving means potentially losing a spouse who still believes, who now looks at you the way you'd look at a stranger who broke into your house. It means awkward holidays where nobody knows what to say, where conversation skirts around the one topic that actually matters. It means watching your own children get pulled deeper into a culture you no longer trust, powerless to stop it because custody agreements and family peace depend on you staying quiet. For some, it means literal exile, a slow fade from group texts, a wedding invitation that never arrives, a grandchild's baptism you find out about after the fact through someone else, weeks later. In a photo posted online, psychologists who study high-control religious groups have a term for what happens next: ambiguous loss. It's the same grief experienced by families of the missing, people who are gone but not gone. Present at the table but functionally absent. Ex-Mormons describe parents who still call, still send birthday cards, but who flinch at any mention of doubt, who steer every conversation back to safe, shallow ground. The weather. The grandkids' soccer schedule. Anything but the truth sitting between them like a locked door nobody will name out loud. The relationship technically survives, but the depth of it, the trust, the shared meaning, the sense of truly being known, quietly dies. One woman described it like this: her mother was standing right in front of her, close enough to touch, and she had never felt more alone in her life. And then there's the harder version. The version where contact doesn't fade, it stops. Completely. Some families treat a member's departure as a kind of spiritual death, a betrayal so severe that continuing the relationship feels, to them, like enabling sin. Church culture, for decades, has quietly reinforced this instinct. Members are taught that families are eternal only through obedience and temple covenants, which means to a believing parent, a child who leaves isn't just making a life choice. They're choosing to be absent from the family in the next life, too. Imagine carrying that belief as a parent, genuinely convinced that your child's decision has cosmic, permanent consequences. Now imagine being the child on the receiving end of it. Watching your mother look at you like you've already died, like grief has already started. Years before anyone's actually gone. This is where the story stops being about theology and starts being about the raw biology of connection. Human brains are not built to process rejection from primary attachment figures gracefully. Neuroscience research consistently shows that social rejection activates the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. Losing a parent's love isn't a metaphor for suffering. It registers physiologically as an injury, the same way a broken bone does. Add religious shunning to that, where the rejection is framed as righteous rather than cruel, wrapped in language about love and eternal families and doing what's best, and you get a uniquely disorienting kind of trauma. Grief with no permission to grieve, because everyone around you insists the door is still open. Just walk back through it. Just come home. Just fix yourself. As if home hadn't already changed the locks the moment you asked a real question out loud. Online, in forums built by and for people who've walked this exact road, the same phrases appear again and again, almost word for word from strangers who've never met. I feel like I died and my family is still grieving the version of me that believed. I have a family. I just don't get to talk to most of them. The hardest part wasn't losing God, it was losing my mom. These aren't isolated complaints scattered across the internet. They're a pattern repeated across thousands of stories, describing a wound that the institutions around them were never built to acknowledge, let alone heal. And because the loss doesn't look like a death, no funeral, no casseroles on the porch, no permission from society to fall apart, people carrying it often do so in near total silence, unsure if they're even allowed to call it grief. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, beat by beat, because the abstract version doesn't capture how ordinary and how devastating it is at the same time. A woman in her early 30s stops believing after months of quiet research she never told anyone about, terrified of what would happen if she said it out loud. When she finally does tell her parents over a phone call she'd rehearsed for weeks, her mother doesn't yell. She goes quiet, then says she needs to pray about how to respond to this. 3 days pass before she calls back. In that silence, the daughter isn't grieving a fight. She's grieving the version of her mother who used to answer the phone without needing to pray about it first. A man in his 40s, married with kids, tells his wife he no longer believes. And within a year's marriage has dissolved not over anger, but over an unbridgeable gap in how they each imagine eternity. She still pictures a forever family on the other side. And he's no longer in that picture, by his own choice in her eyes. He now sees his children every other weekend. A teenager comes out to their bishop during a routine interview, expecting guidance, and instead walks out of that room carrying a shame they didn't have going in, a shame that, years later, still shapes how they introduce themselves to new people. None of these are extreme. Cherry-picked cases. Ask anyone who works with former members, therapists, support group facilitators, researchers who study high-demand religious groups, and they'll tell you these stories are the median, not the outlier. What varies isn't whether the loss happens. It's how loud or quiet it is, how fast or slow, whether it looks like a single door slamming or 100 small doors closing one at a time over the course of a decade. And there's a particular cruelty in the slow version that people rarely talk about because it doesn't photograph well and it doesn't fit into a single dramatic headline. It's the mother who still texts happy birthday every year on schedule, polite and warm on the surface, but who hasn't asked her adult child a real question about their actual life in half a decade. It's the sibling group chat that quietly stops including you after you mention, once, that you're not going to the temple ceiling. It's showing up to Thanksgiving and realizing halfway through the meal that everyone at the table already agreed beforehand not to bring up anything real, and you're the reason for that unspoken agreement. Nobody said the words, "You're not welcome here." Nobody has to. The absence does the talking, but here's the turning point in this story. The part that changes everything about how we should understand it. This isn't really about religion being cruel or families being broken. It's about what happens to any human relationship when belonging becomes conditional. That's the mechanism underneath all of it. Strip away the specific theology and you're left with a universal, almost mathematical truth about how tight-knit groups protect themselves. The tighter the community, the higher the cost of leaving it. Cults use this. Extreme political movements use this. Even ordinary friend groups do a smaller, quieter version of this without ever realizing it. What makes high-control religion uniquely painful isn't that the mechanism is unusual. It's that it operates inside the relationships that are supposed to be the most unconditional ones we Have parents, siblings, children, the people evolution built us to trust no matter what. Now filtered through a test of belief. And once you see the mechanism clearly, something remarkable happens. The people who've survived it stop asking, "What's wrong with my family?" and start asking, "What happened to the system my family is operating inside of?" That reframe is where healing actually begins, according to therapists who specialize in this exact kind of trauma. They point to a specific turning point in recovery, the moment a person stops internalizing the shunning as evidence they were unlovable, and starts recognizing it as a predictable output of a closed information system reacting to a perceived threat. The parent isn't a monster. In most cases, the parent is terrified, grieving, and operating inside a framework that offers them no other socially sanctioned response. They were taught from their own childhood that this is what love requires. Understanding that doesn't erase the pain, but it changes what the pain means, and that shift alone is often the first real breath someone takes in years. This is where the deeper meaning of the whole story lives. Because ambiguous loss, left unaddressed, doesn't just sit quietly in the background of someone's life. It reshapes how they trust, how they parent their own kids, how they build every relationship that comes after. Many former members describe a strange, disorienting kind of freedom mixed with grief, free to think for themselves for the first time in their adult lives, and simultaneously mourning a version of family life they'll never get back, the one they used to picture at Christmas. All the chairs full, nobody performing anything. Some rebuild entirely new communities from scratch, found families, online support groups, friendships forged specifically because they understand this particular kind of loss without needing it explained twice. Others spend years in a painful in-between, still attending the occasional family dinner, still biting their tongue, still performing a version of belief they no longer feel, just to keep one seat at that table a little longer. There's also a quieter, more hopeful thread running underneath all of this. One that rarely makes it into the headlines because it doesn't have the same dramatic pull as a story about loss. Not every family stays frozen. Some parents, years later, after their own private reckoning, reach back out, not with an apology exactly, but with an attempt, a small opening, a question about grandkids that turns into a real conversation for the first time in years. Some siblings quietly become allies, sending a private message that says, in effect, "I don't understand your choice, but I still love you," even if they'd never say it in front of the rest of the family. These repairs are rarely clean, rarely total, and almost never come with the closure people hope for going in. But they happen often enough that support groups for former members consistently tell people not to assume the door is permanently welded shut, even when it feels that way in the moment. Grief and reconciliation, it turns out, aren't mutually exclusive. They can run on parallel tracks for years, sometimes for the rest of a person's life, and this is the part that matters far beyond any one religion, far beyond Utah, far beyond a single church. Every one of us exists inside relationships that carry some kind of condition, spoken or unspoken. A family that only accepts a certain kind of life choice, a friend group that quietly punishes disagreement, a workplace culture that treats loyalty as more important than honesty. The ex-Mormon experience is an extreme, high-stakes version of something almost everyone will brush up against at some point. The moment your authentic self and your belongings start to conflict, and you realize you can't have both at full strength. What people who've survived religious shunning can teach the rest of us is what it actually costs to choose truth over approval, and, just as importantly, what it looks like to survive that choice and come out whole on the other side, instead of hollowed out by it. So if you're watching this and some part of it feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever gone quiet at a family dinner to avoid a fight, if you've ever measured your words to keep the peace, if you've ever felt like being fully honest might cost you people you love, you're not imagining the stakes. They're real, and they're heavier than most people admit out loud. But so is the other side of it. The people in this story who lost their families didn't just survive the loss. Many of them built something new on the other side of it. Relationships based on choice instead of obligation, honesty instead of performance, a version of belonging that doesn't require them to disappear a piece of themselves at the door just to keep their seat at the table. That's not a small consolation. For a lot of them, that's the entire point, the thing that made the whole painful journey worth it. If this story moves something in you, or if it mirrors something in your own life, that's exactly why it needed to be told. Subscribe if you want more stories that go past the surface of what religion, family, and belonging actually cost people, because this conversation is only getting started. And the next story might hit even closer to home than you expect.